You wake up before the sun. Smoke drifts from hundreds of hearths below you. Somewhere close, a wooden drum starts to beat, low and steady, and thousands of people are already moving toward the plaza. You are standing on top of the largest man-made mound in North America, and beneath your feet is a city. Not a village. Not a campsite. A city. For most of your life, you were probably taught that cities in ancient America belonged to the Maya or the Aztec, far to the south, in stone temples swallowed by jungle. But almost 1,000 years ago, in the floodplain across the river from what is now St. Louis, Missouri, a Native American metropolis rose out of the earth and briefly became one of the largest cities on the planet. It was called Cahokia. And almost nobody outside the archaeology world knows its name. Let's reconstruct what your life actually looked like there. Archaeologist Timothy Pauketat, who has spent decades excavating the Cahokia region for the University of Illinois, has shown that at its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia may have held as many as 20,000 residents in its core, with tens of thousands more living in farms and towns spread across the surrounding countryside known today as the American Bottom. To put that in perspective, that made it larger than London was at the same moment in history. You would have shared this floodplain with more neighbors than most European city dwellers of your era ever saw in one place. Your day would not start in a hut. It would start in a rectangular home built from wattle and daub, walls of woven branches packed with clay, topped by a thatched roof that kept out the heavy Mississippi rain. Inside, woven cane mats cover a floor sunk slightly below ground level, a simple trick that keeps you cooler in the brutal river valley summers and warmer through the winter. Your fire pit sits near the doorway. Your family sleeps close together on those mats, because a home like this is built for shared warmth, not for privacy the way a modern house is. Step outside, and the scale of the place hits you. Cahokia was not a sprawl of scattered huts. It was organized, almost engineered. A grand plaza stretched out below the largest mound, an open space so large it could have held dozens of football fields inside it, and around that plaza rose more than 100 earthen mounds. Some were flat-topped platforms, built to hold temples or the homes of leaders, so that power in Cahokia was, quite literally, elevated above everyone else. Others were rounded burial mounds, resting places for the dead built up over generations. The largest mound of all, now called Monk's Mound by archaeologists, rose roughly 10 stories above the plaza. Researchers estimate it required somewhere around 14 million basketloads of soil, each one carried by hand, dumped, packed, and carried again. You would not have watched it built in a single season. You would have watched it grow a little higher every year of your life, the way a family slowly adds onto a house, except here, an entire city added to it together. Why would a farming society commit that much labor to hauling dirt? Archaeologist Susan Alt, who has worked alongside Pauketat excavating sites like the Emerald Acropolis just east of the main city, has an answer tied to something you would have felt just as strongly as anyone standing in that plaza: the sky. Emerald was aligned with the movements of the moon, built to track an 18.6-year cycle in which the moon rises and sets at its most extreme points on the horizon. Ancient observers tracked this without telescopes, without written mathematics, using nothing but generations of careful watching passed down as memory. Cahokia was not only a marketplace and a farm town. It was a ceremonial capital, and its architecture was a calendar carved directly into the land. Your food would have depended on one plant above all others: corn. Maize agriculture had only recently exploded across the Mississippi Valley in the centuries before Cahokia's rise, and it is one of the central reasons the city could feed so many people living so close together. You would grind dried corn kernels on stone slabs called manos and metates, then combine it with beans and squash grown in the same fields, a farming method historians now call the Three Sisters, in which each plant supports the growth of the others. The corn stalks give the bean vines something to climb. The beans return nitrogen to the soil. The wide squash leaves shade the ground and choke out weeds. You would also eat catfish, freshwater mussels, deer, and wild waterfowl pulled from the marshes and backwaters surrounding the city. Because a floodplain this rich in water was also rich in protein most farming societies of that era never had reliable access to. But surplus food creates something else, something you would have felt every single day of your life in Cahokia. It creates hierarchy. And Cahokia's hierarchy was steep. Excavations at a burial site archaeologists call Mound 72 uncovered graves that reshaped how historians understand power in this city. One man was buried on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads, arranged in the unmistakable shape of a falcon, a symbol tied to warfare and to the heavens. Buried nearby were dozens of other people, some clearly high-status individuals laid to rest with care, others showing signs of violent death, sacrificed alongside the powerful the way retainers were in other early state societies around the world. If you lived in Cahokia, your position in that plaza was never equal to your neighbors. Some households controlled trade routes stretching as far as the Gulf of Mexico to the south and the Great Lakes to the north, moving copper, shells, and stone across a trade network thousands of miles wide. Others spent their entire lives working the fields that fed the elite standing above them on the mounds. Picture an ordinary afternoon. You are not a leader. You are one of the tens of thousands of ordinary Cahokians who make the city function. You spend your morning in the cornfields outside the city center, your hands raw from the work, while overhead, smoke rises from a temple fire on top of the tallest mound, a fire that never seems to fully go out. At midday, you carry your harvest toward the central plaza, where traders have arrived with polished shell beads carried up from the Gulf Coast and copper hammered thin, carried down from the shores of Lake Superior. You do not own these things. You watch them pass from hand to hand above your station in life, the way a modern person might watch luxury goods pass through a city they can see but never quite touch. In the evenings, you would gather at the edge of the plaza to watch a game called chunkey, one of the most widespread sports in pre-colonial North America. A player rolls a small disc-shaped stone across the ground, and competitors hurl long wooden poles at the spot where they predict it will stop, betting everything from shell beads to their own freedom on the outcome. Archaeologists have found chunky stones polished smooth from generations of use, and the game itself survived among native nations for centuries after Cahokia emptied, carried forward long after the mounds went quiet. Standing at the edge of that plaza, cheering with thousands of your neighbors as the stone rolls across packed earth, you would feel something that has not changed in 1,000 years, the pull of a crowd united around a shared contest. Skeletal remains recovered from the region also tell historians something Cahokia's grand architecture never could. Bioarchaeologists studying bones from the area have found signs of hard physical labor in nearly everyone, elite and common alike, along with evidence of periodic nutritional stress tied to years when the corn harvest came up short. Life inside the biggest city on the continent was not simply a story of temples and shell beads. It was also a story of aching backs, seasonal hunger, and the constant physical toll of building something this large by hand, generation after generation, without wheels, without draft animals, and without metal tools of any kind. Here is the twist that surprises almost everyone once they hear it: Cahokia's rise may have carried the seeds of its own collapse, quietly, for more than a century before anyone noticed. The same concentration of people that built Monk's Mound also required enormous quantities of construction timber and firewood, stripped from the forests surrounding the city. Researchers studying soil layers in the region have connected this deforestation to increased flooding and erosion in the floodplain over time, the very land the city depended on for food. Add to that a period of colder, wetter climate that swept across the wider region in the 1200s, sometimes called the Little Ice Age's early edge, and the farmland that once fed 20,000 people packed under one skyline of smoke and ceremony began, slowly, to fail. By around 1350, Cahokia was largely abandoned. Not destroyed in a single dramatic battle or fire, the way empires often fall in the stories you were told as a child. Just slowly, steadily emptied, as the very density and ambition that made this city a wonder eventually made it fragile. If this sounds oddly familiar, it should. You have almost certainly lived through some version of this pattern yourself, just at a different scale. A city grows fast because it is efficient, connected, and rich in resources. That same growth strains the very systems holding it together, whether that system is a floodplain in the 12th century or a supply chain in your own century. Historians and climate scientists studying Cahokia today are not simply reconstructing a lost civilization for its own sake. They are studying an early American case of a truth that keeps repeating through history and through your own life: the systems that make life abundant are often the same systems that make it fragile the moment the climate or the resources shift beneath them. Cahokia's descendants did not vanish, even though the city itself did. Their traditions carried forward into later nations of the Mississippi Valley and the Plains, including the Osage and the Quapaw, whose oral histories and continued presence in the region connect directly back to the mound-building world you have just walked through in your imagination. The city disappeared from the landscape. The people its builders became did not. Today, Cahokia Mounds is preserved as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Illinois, one of only a small handful of such sites in the entire United States, and Monk's Mound still rises above the floodplain exactly where it always has, silent, grass-covered, and largely unknown to the millions of Americans who drive past it on the interstate every single year without a second glance. So the next time you stand somewhere your own city's skyline blocks out the horizon, remember this. Almost 1,000 years ago, on this same continent, in this same river valley, someone stood exactly where you are standing now. Smoke drifted from hundreds of hearths below them. A drum was already beating in the plaza. And for one extraordinary stretch of American history, they were living in the biggest city on the entire continent, and they had no idea it would not last.